In 2012, a little girl was playing on her school playground in a small village in Australia. As the girl played with her friends, she suddenly blurted out something very disturbing. She told her friends that her 12-year-old sister was pregnant and they didn't know which of her brothers was the baby's father. This comment made its way to the local authorities and an investigation was immediately launched. But the police were not prepared for what they were about to find. This was not an isolated case of abuse between a brother and a sister. They had actually uncovered the worst case of incest and inbreeding Australia had ever seen. This family had been involved in cult-like incestuous practices dating back 5 generations. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Sommer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime, cults, and heinous history. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an upload. Today we're talking about a family known only to the public as the Colt family, and that's Colt, C-O-L-T. I know it sounds like I'm saying cult, like C-U-L-T, but it's Colt, C-O-L-T. And Colt is not actually their last name. The identities of every single person involved in this case has been protected. Even the perpetrators in this case, their identities are also protected. So every single name that I'm using in this video are just actually pseudonyms that were given by the court. This case is absolutely crazy. I've never heard of such a deeply rooted incestuous doctrine running through a single family. There were nearly 40 members of the Colt family when this case broke, and several of the 40 members were found to be the product of incest. And like I said, this dates back at least 5 generations, so there is a lot to unpack here, but before we get started, let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Twisted Tangle. You guys know how much I love a good mobile game. It's my go-to when I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed or if I just want to relax and unwind, and lately I have been playing a lot of Twisted Tangle. It's a 3D knot solving puzzle game, and there's over 1,000 unique levels, and it's constantly growing. This game really does get your mind going. You have to be strategic when you're unraveling these knots, and you have to unravel everything within a certain time frame or you'll have to start over, and there are some pretty challenging levels. The hard and epic stages really require some thinking. Some of the stages look absolutely insane at first. They really do look impossible, but once you get going, you'll start to unravel the knots little by little, finessing the strands until you finally have everything cleared. And every single time I clear a stage, especially one of the super hard ones, I feel so accomplished and proud of myself. I mean, just look at this stage. This looks impossible, but it's not. It takes some strategy, it takes some thinking, maybe a little help from some of the special items, but you really will surprise yourself in the end. This game is a great mental distraction because it gets you to focus all of your energy and attention on solving these puzzles. I also love that this game does not require Wi-Fi to play, so I can play anywhere, anytime. Twisted Tangle has over 140,000 ratings on the App Store with an overall rating of a 4.6. And if you want to join the thousands of Twisted Tangle players, just click the link in my description box or scan the QR code on the screen right now to download Twisted Tangle for free. Thanks again to Twisted Tangle for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case. In 2012, right outside of Borowa, New South Wales, there was a large family living on an isolated farm in the woods. This family is now known to the public as the Colt family, but as I mentioned earlier, this is not their real last name. The Colt family was known around the local area as kind of strange, very standoffish, and somewhat of a mystery. Very few people outside of the family were ever permitted on the farm. There were several members of this family. Like I said, there were like 40 members of the Colt clan living on this property. There were several adults, lots of children, but the locals didn't even know that there were that many people living on the property because they were so isolated, because they didn't really talk to outsiders, because they didn't really let anyone else on their farm. Some of the adults would leave the property to work odd jobs here and there, but for the most part, this family was cut off from the outside world. The children were kept away from society and they were not enrolled in public school. At least at first they were not enrolled in public school, but eventually child services looked into the family because they were getting benefits from the government for all of these kids that they had, and it was discovered that the kids were not going to school. So eventually the adults were forced to send some of the kids to school, and that is what actually brought this whole crazy situation to light. Now, the children were technically enrolled in school, but they did not attend regularly. Their attendance was extremely spotty, and when the kids did show up to school, they were very dirty. It was obvious that they weren't getting the medical care that they needed. They were intellectually very behind their peers, and so they were already kind of on the teacher's radar. You know, some of the teachers had a weird feeling about this family. Now, I don't know if the school called child services to investigate prior to what happens in 2012, but someone did report the family on multiple occasions, actually. Between the years of 2010 and 2012, 2012, a total of 7 risk of significant harm reports were filed by an anonymous caller or callers, but nothing was really ever done. But then one day, one of the Colt children was at school. She was playing on the playground with her friends when suddenly she said something along the lines of, "My sister is pregnant, but we don't know which one of our brothers is the father." And of course, there are a lot of things wrong with that statement. First of all, the child who made this comment was an elementary school age child. And the way she said this, it just gave the impression that she didn't understand how socially unacceptable, how illegal, or just how plain wrong this was. And the sister that she was referring to was only like 12 years old. So this is an underage child, which means that if this is in fact true, then there is some serious sexual abuse taking place in this home. So the girl made this comment about her sister being pregnant, and another child overheard this conversation and they went and told an adult, and eventually it was reported to the local authorities. And so the authorities decided to take a closer look at this family. And on July 18th, 2012, police and child services paid the Colt clan a visit and an investigation was opened. So we know very little about the original matriarch and patriarch of this family. The pseudonyms that they were given are Tim and June Colt, and June was born in 1948 and Tim was born in 1943. They got married in 1966 when June was 18 and Tim was 23. And the inbreeding actually started with June's parents because June's parents were actually brother and sister. And that's really all we know about June and Tim's early life. They went on to have 7 kids together, and the pseudonyms for their children are Rhonda, Betty, Sherry, Frank, Charlie, Paula, and Martha. Frank is also referred to as Roderick in some of the sources as well. Then at some point in the 70s, the entire family left New Zealand and moved to Australia. And at first they lived in Victoria, which is in the southeastern part of Australia, but the family didn't really stay in one place for too long. They lived a pretty nomadic lifestyle. They were constantly moving around Australia. They were going from state to state, never really staying put in any specific place for very long. Then when the children got older, Tim started a family band that included himself, his son Charlie, his daughter Martha, and another daughter, but I'm not quite sure which one of the other daughters. But they played the guitar, the mandolin, they would sing, they performed at festivals and like music halls all over Australia. And their band actually gained a little following. They recorded albums. They even released an album of love songs, which is very chilling when you learn about the super messed up beliefs and practices that this family was hiding, because Tim Colt started sexually abusing his daughters when they were only 12 years old. And he would also encourage his children to engage in sexual activity with each other as well. He started brainwashing his children to believe that having sex with their siblings and their parents was normal. The oldest daughter, Rhonda, went on to have 5 kids, 4 of which were fathered by her own father, Tim. Martha, the youngest daughter, had 6 children, and most of those children were fathered by her brother, Charlie, but it is thought that Tim may have fathered some of those kids as well. But Betty was Tim's favorite daughter. Betty would become the next matriarch of the Colt clan. Betty went on to have 13 children, and it's believed that most of those children were fathered by her dad, Tim. And Martha and Charlie started living as kind of like husband and wife. They started sharing a bed and they became kind of like a couple. But for the most part, everyone just had sex with everyone in the family. There seemed to be no limits at all. The children, starting from an extremely young age, were either abused by an adult or abused by one of the other children. One of Betty's daughters, Petra, said that her uncle Charlie started raping her when she was very young, and it continued for years. And this type of thing happened all throughout this family. And when one of the girls got pregnant, they were not allowed to go to the doctors for like a checkup or anything. And if they did end up giving birth in a hospital, they would lie about the true identity of the fathers. And this is one of the reasons why the family moved around so much. If they felt like the locals were starting to catch on to what was happening, they would just up and move. They moved several times throughout the year. And remember, they still have their little wholesome family band going on. They're still traveling to venues all over Australia, playing country love songs to crowds of people. And all the while, they are actually living in a literal incest cult with their father, Tim, as the leader. Then in 2001, the matriarch, June Colt, died. And I'm not sure what her cause of death was. She was still pretty young when she died. She was only in her 50s. But after her death, the entire clan up and moved to a very remote area of Western Australia. And they preferred living in remote areas now since their clan had grown so much. There were so many kids now. So no neighbors meant no questions from outsiders. The cycle of incest just continued, and now Betty was becoming like her father Tim's understudy. She would be the one to take over as head of the family after Tim was gone. And so when Tim did die in 2009, Betty was seen as the leader. The family purchased a plot of land outside of Borowa, New South Wales, and this property was perfect. It was large enough for the growing family. It was secluded in a backwoods area away from the rest of society. No one would even notice that they were there. And unfortunately, the cycle of abuse and incest and inbreeding, it just continued. Instead of recognizing how messed up the situation was and putting an end to literally generations of abuse once Tim died, his children just worked to perpetuate it. The adults in the family indoctrinated their own children to think that sexual relationships with family members was okay. And not only was it okay, it was encouraged and actually expected in this family. The youngest members of the clan were likely easier to manipulate and control and brainwash because most of them were products of multiple generations of inbreeding. So they had a lot of cognitive delays. Many of them couldn't even speak coherently. They were extremely vulnerable, and this made them easier targets for the older, more predatory members of this incest cult. It would be easier for the older members to convince the children that this was totally fine. It's completely normal for you to have sex with your brother. It's completely fine that your mother is openly engaging in all sorts of sexual activities with her father and her brother and even her own children. That's what makes this family so much like a cult. There wasn't a religious aspect to this case, at least not that I know of, but their doctrine was free love with absolutely zero limitations. There was no age limit. There was no relation limit. And so the brains of these children were just completely poisoned, starting basically from birth. They were just thrown into a world where they were surrounded by sexual predators and they were cut off from everyone else. Just imagine that you are completely cut off from the outside world. You are kept in total isolation on a farm in the middle of nowhere. The rest of society doesn't even know you exist. And every single day of your life, you have to wake up and worry that not just one rogue, disgusting relative will assault you. You have to fear all of your relatives, and you can't even confide in your parents or someone else in your family because they're all either in on it or they're suffering the same abuse. It's a very fucked up situation. What's even more fucked up is how long this went on. And if it hadn't been for that one comment that that little girl made on the playground that day, the cycle of abuse, incest, inbreeding, brainwashing in this family might still be going on today. Which brings us back to that day in July of 2012, the day that police and child services paid a visit to the Colt farm, and they were not prepared for what they saw. What they initially noticed was just the absolutely horrendous conditions that these people were living in. The property was pretty big. There were 2 travel trailers or RVs set up on the property. There was also a small garden shed and a larger shed that had tents set up inside, and there were these small little beds set up inside of the tents. Everything was filthy. Both of the RVs had dirt and hazardous materials on nearly every surface. There was mud and cigarette butts all over the floor. There was trash everywhere. There was an actual kangaroo found sleeping in one of the kids' beds. They had a tiny kitchen area. It was also completely filthy. There was dirt on the cooking surfaces. Some of the windows were broken out of the RVs and there were exposed wires everywhere. There was no running water. There were no toilets, no shower, no bathtub. The kids were absolutely filthy. Everyone had been going to the bathroom in the woods and they had no toilet paper, so you can imagine how that went. There was a small tub found in one of the rooms that just had a little bit of water in it, and that is where everyone was washing their hands. And because they didn't have running water or showers and stuff, they obviously couldn't bathe properly, and so everyone was just completely filthy. The caseworkers have said that the stench of urine and feces was almost too much to handle. It was obvious to the authorities that these people had been living in just abhorrent conditions for years. And so it was decided that day that the children would be removed from the farm and placed into foster care while the investigation proceeded. They could only remove the underage children from the farm, so a total of 12 children were removed, and they ranged in age from 5 to 15 years old. And these kids were in absolutely terrible physical and mental condition. Nearly all of them had severe fungal infections. They all had just absolutely terrible dental problems. They couldn't read or write. Some of them could barely speak. They couldn't hold utensils to eat. They would eat with their hands instead. They had never had access to forks and spoons and knives, so they didn't know how to use them. So they just used their hands. They didn't know how to use toilet paper. Some of them didn't even know what toilet paper even was. They did not know how to brush their teeth. They had zero knowledge of even the most most basic hygiene. Some of the children had severe viral infections. They were all underweight, malnourished. Many of the children needed immediate medical care. Some of them walked with a limp. One of the boys had severe untreated psoriasis. And some of the children would soil themselves. And this was even the case with the oldest kids. Even the teenagers would just go to the bathroom in their pants. All but one of the kids was very behind intellectually. Bobby, the 15-year-old, was said to be functioning at a kindergarten level. Many of the children had some sort of physical abnormality as well. They were described as having low-slung ears and misaligned facial features, and the teens and adults looked decades older than their actual age. Many of the kids had to be admitted to the hospital to treat various illnesses. They were just in terrible shape. And while the children were in foster care, some of them started to exhibit some really disturbing behaviors. Some of them would talk about very sexual things, and they would also do very sexual things. And this goes for even the youngest kids. Cindy, the youngest of the kids that were taken, her foster parents caught her doing things to herself on multiple occasions, and she was only 5 years old. And she told them that her siblings had taught her how to do that to herself. One of the children continuously tried to kiss their foster dad in an inappropriate way, and when he would stop her and say, don't do that, that's inappropriate, she would become very upset. Dwayne and Brian, who were 9 and 12 years old, were caught tying up their 18-year-old foster sister, and thankfully they were caught before anything more sinister happened, but I don't even want to know what they were planning to do to her. Some of the boys told their foster parents that they used to mutilate the genitals of the farm animals just for fun, just because they were bored. And since the children were not all placed in the same family, they were broken up, amongst several different foster parents. They would have visitation sometimes with their siblings, and they were seen being very inappropriate with each other in front of caseworkers. Like, they weren't even trying to hide it because they didn't really understand that what they were doing was wrong. 12-year-old Brian was seen putting his hand on 8-year-old Carmen's knee multiple times, and then he would attempt to run his hand up her thigh. It was becoming very obvious to investigators that these kids had been through some serious sexual trauma. And it took a little time to get the kids to trust the caseworkers and the investigators. They were upset, all they had ever known was that farm and their relatives their entire lives. And when they were removed, they were angry. Some of the kids started to get aggressive. Some of them were threatening to stab therapists and doctors. They were threatening to slit their throats or cut their fingers off. But eventually they did start to soften and open up and talk about all of the terrible things that they were forced to do while they were living on the farm. 7-year-old Nadia said that she witnessed her mother and her uncle having sex in the tent right next to her. Her mother was Martha, and it's believed that her biological father was her uncle Charlie. And this was something that several of the kids would say. They witnessed the adults having sex with each other on multiple occasions. Dwayne told his foster parents that he and his siblings were, quote, told to never tell anyone that his father was in fact Betty Colt's father, as Betty Colt would go to jail because her father had started having sex with her when she was 12 years old. So this is the tactic that the family used to keep the kids from telling anyone what was happening in the home. There was always this looming threat that Betty would go to jail if anyone found out, and so this is how they were keeping the kids quiet. One of the girls, Kimberly, who was 13, said that she performed oral sex on her brother Dwayne, who was 9 years old, while Carmen, who was 8, watched. And when Kimberly went and told her mother Raylene about it, she didn't do anything. Some of the girls told stories about being tied up to trees while they were being assaulted by their brothers and their cousins and uncles. They also said that they had used sticks to sexually assault them as well. A couple of the younger girls told therapists that they would run and hide in the woods from the men and the boys in the clan, just in a desperate attempt to escape the abuse. Basically, just any messed up, disgusting, depraved sexual act that you can think of was likely happening in this family. The adult relatives were all sleeping together. The adults were assaulting the kids, and the kids were doing disturbing things to each other. It was like a free-for-all on that farm. And the kids, while they were in foster care, they started to open up about who their fathers really were. Many of Martha's kids said that their Uncle Charlie was their father. Kimberly's mother was Raylene, and Raylene's mother was Betty. And Kimberly told her foster parents that she had the same same father as her mother and her grandmother, meaning that Tim Colt was her father. So that means that Tim had raped one of his granddaughters, Raylene, and he was the biological father of his great-granddaughter, Kimberly. It's thought that Kimberly is the most inbred member of the family. So after the foster parents and investigators and therapists and caseworkers hear all of these horrible things, they decided that DNA testing needed to be done. And so in September of 2012, the court ordered genetic testing on all 12 of the minors who were removed from the farm. And 11 of the 12 tests came back confirming the allegations of incest. Some of the children were the products of just related mothers and fathers, so that would be like half siblings, cousins, uncles, and some of the children were the product of closely related mothers and fathers. So that would be like full siblings or a parent and their child. The only child who did not have related parents was the youngest child of the 12 removed, and that was 5-year-old Cindy. And Cindy is the youngest daughter of Rhonda. Rhonda claimed that Cindy's father was a man named Jerry Phelps, and she had a brief affair with him while she was working as a fruit picker on his farm. And it's interesting to note that Cindy, the only child with unrelated parents, was the only child on the farm who was said to be well-spoken. She was mostly on track developmentally, and she had no learning disabilities. As far as I know, the others in the clan were not DNA tested. I think it was just the underage members who were removed from the home. So the 11 out of 12 doesn't really paint the whole picture here. We know that there was way more cases of inbreeding in this family. Tim Colt alone is thought to have fathered at least 18 children in the clan with his daughters and his granddaughters. It's really disappointing that Tim died before he had to face any charges or had to face the public when this all came out, because he was the catalyst for what unfolded in this case. He was the first leader of this incest cult. So I've debated on whether or not to break down this family tree person by person, and I decided against it. If I start going through the family tree person by person, it's going to start getting really confusing. If I just start spitting out names, there are just way too many people involved in this case. I'm going to put the family tree on the screen if you want to pause and take a look. There are several versions of this family tree. This is the one that looked the closest to what I was reading in the court documents. This doesn't give us the full picture, and we'll likely never know the full scope of the inbreeding in this family. There was at least one death related to the inbreeding. A 2-month-old baby girl named Sally died of a rare genetic disorder in 2012, right before this case broke. Tammy Colt is the second daughter of Betty Colt, and it's very likely that her father was either one of her uncles or her grandfather, Tim. Tammy and her brother Derek had 3 kids together, and their youngest child was Sally. Sally was born with a disorder called Zellweger syndrome. This is a rare genetic disorder, and it affects the kidneys, the brain, the liver, lots of other parts of the body as well, and it's usually fatal. It's an autosomal recessive disorder, and this means that both of the parents have to be carriers of the same mutated gene, and they both have to pass on that mutated copy of the gene for the disorder to actually occur in one of the children. So Tammy and her brother Derek were both carriers for that same mutated gene that causes Zellweger syndrome, and they both passed that gene on to Sally. Their 2 other children were not born with Zellweger syndrome, but they would still have a 50% chance of being carriers for the gene. Since this disorder only occurs if both parents each pass on the same mutated gene, the likelihood of this happening increases in inbred families because you're more likely to share the same mutated genes as your relatives. So in the case of the Colt clan, because the inbreeding had been going on for so long, through so many generations, those genes were being shared by a lot of people, and those people were making babies together, and that put those babies at higher risk of developing some sort of genetic issue. Another Colt child died, but it's unclear what caused the death in that case. Martha had a daughter named Donna who died at just 2 weeks old. So it has now been genetically proven that incest had been going on for years, involving multiple people. The children have been abused and neglected. They're talking about all of this abuse and neglect. And after everything that I have just told you, you would think that some seriously harsh prison sentences would have been handed down. But I'm sorry to say that the adults in this case served little to no jail time. The children were taken away from all of the mothers, and it was ruled that they would have no contact with their kids until the kids turned 18 and were legally adults. The court decided that it was just too risky to ever let the kids go back into their mother's care because all of the mothers were denying that even one case of incest ever occurred in the family. And since they were not owning up to anything, the court thought, how can they really get the help that they need and create, a better, healthy, safe environment for these kids if they can't even admit what happened? The women were telling the judge that every one of those children had been conceived by outsiders who were unrelated to the family. They said that most of the fathers were drifters, and each of these fathers had names and backstories. One of these alleged fathers was named Sven, and he was a Scandinavian tourist. The judge tried to explain to them that they had DNA proof that this was a lie. The fathers were all either related or closely related to 11 of the 12 children tested. But Betty and Rhonda and Martha and Raylene, they just kept denying it, and they could not understand why the court would believe the DNA test over their word. So like I said, the kids were taken away from their parents. They were now in foster homes, and the mothers were not supposed to have any contact with them. But in 2013, Betty devised a plan to kidnap her 15-year-old son Bobby and her 14-year-old son Billy from their foster family. Betty had secretly slipped her sons a cell phone so they could stay in touch despite the court order that Betty was to have no contact with them. The boys kept the phone in a plastic bag and they hid it in some bushes near their foster home, and they would sneak off and call their mother, send her text messages. But police were still investigating all of the incest and abuse allegations, and so they had Betty's phone tapped so they could hear these conversations that she was having with her sons, and they heard her speaking sexually to her son Bobby on multiple occasions. Betty told her son Bobby that his voice sounded sexy. She also called him gorgeous and told him that she couldn't wait to see him again. These conversations were said to be very flirtatious, at least on Betty's part. Just to reiterate, this is her 15-year-old son that she's talking to. And so police heard these creepy exchanges, and they also heard this plot that Betty had, about kidnapping her sons. And she said that she was going to kidnap them and take them to South Australia, where they would be out of the reach of the New South Wales authorities, and they could all get jobs working as fruit pickers. So once police heard all of this and they knew that Betty was about to try to execute this kidnapping plot, she was arrested in 2013, and she ended up being sentenced to 12 months in prison. And the only other person that served any significant time in this case was Betty's brother Roderick. He was charged with raping his niece Petra back in 2010. During the police investigation, Petra came forward and said that one day in 2010 she had a fight with her mother Betty, and she took off and started walking down the road. Her uncle Roderick saw her walking down the road, and so he stopped in his truck. He snatched Petra, he threw her into his truck and violently assaulted her. And once the assault was over, he pushed her out of his truck and called her an ungrateful bitch and a pig. And Petra was 17 years old when this happened. Roderick was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years in prison for the rape of Petra. And after everything was said and done, police had looked into the family, looked into all of the allegations of incest and inbreeding, abuse. There were a total of 80 charges brought against 8 of the adults in the clan. That was Betty, Martha, Rhonda, Cliff, Derek, Charlie, Raylene, and Roderick. These charges included incest, child sexual abuse, and indecency with a child, and perjury. But, and I do not know why, most of these charges were dropped. Charlie alone was being charged with 27 of the 80 counts. He was one of the worst offenders in this case. But in the end, he was only actually charged with 2 counts of rape of a minor under the age of 10. He pleaded not guilty to those charges, and the case went to trial, and the foster mother of the girl in question got on the stand and testified about the condition the little girl was in when she first arrived in her home. And this woman cried as she spoke about the stories that the little girl had told her about all the sexual abuse that she had suffered. But in the end, Charlie was found not guilty. The judge who acquitted him cited inconsistencies in the girl's police interviews and evidence, and so he was acquitted. But the women in the clan did serve some jail time for committing perjury. They continued to lie about the paternity of the children, and so they each served like 1 or 2 year sentences. I wish that I had a solid update about the children, but because their identities have been kept secret, we don't really know very much about how they're doing today. I truly hope that they are in a safer environment. A lot of the kids in this case are adults now, and I do know that some of them seem to have gotten back in contact with Betty and the other women in the clan. I went down the rabbit hole with the research on this case, and there are areas of the internet that are dedicated to unraveling this case and trying to piece together the family tree. And of course, people have managed to uncover the identities of some of the perpetrators, including the actual name of Betty Colt. And people have managed to find Betty's social social media accounts, and 99% of the people that she follows are members of this family. So even now, it seems like the cults are sticking together. And Betty even posted a photo of herself with two of her relatives with the words, "Love makes a family," which is just sick. I just hope that the kids have gotten the help that they need, and the adults as well. I personally think that they should have served a lot of jail time for what they did, but that obviously didn't happen. So hopefully they at least got some help. The adults in this case did start out as victims. They were all victims of abuse and incest because of Tim, the things that they went through, the things that they witnessed. No child should ever have to go through that. But someone should have put an end to the cycle of abuse. And instead, they just did their absolute best to just keep it going, even after Tim died. So that's just my opinion. I think that the adults should have been held responsible, brainwashed or not. They obviously knew what they were doing was wrong if they were telling the kids to keep it a secret and, they were lying about the paternity. But I want to know what you guys think. So let me know down in the comments. Tell me how you feel about the adults in this case. Do you view them more as victims, or do you think that they are just as culpable as their father in the end? Thanks again to Twisted Tangle for sponsoring, and don't forget to click the link in the description box or scan the QR code on the screen to download Twisted Tangle for free. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you guys to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.